Hi everyone, so this video is going to look at the effect of supply shocks on the economy. Specifically, I'm going to be talking about negative supply shocks, and we will look at two possible response mechanisms to a negative supply shock. The first is known as a natural adjustment mechanism, whereby there is no intervention from either government or from the Reserve Bank. And the second would be known as accommodating the supply shock, and that would involve some intervention from either Treasury or the Reserve Bank. So the first point of call is to remember that when we're thinking about supply shocks, we're looking at the effect of, in this case, negative supply shock, and the first effect of that would be to decrease the amount of goods and services that firms can supply. A typical example of a supply shock would be an oil price increase, a big and sustained oil price increase, for example, and that has a pervasive effect on the ability of firms to supply goods and services, particularly because the oil price affects firms' cost of transportation. So what we have in terms of the diagram is an aggregate demand and aggregate supply model diagram. Remember, when you draw this, to correctly label the axes. On the horizontal axis, we're measuring real output. On the vertical axis, we're measuring the price level. The aggregate demand curve is negatively sloped because as the prices of goods and services increase, the quantity of goods and services demanded will decrease. And here I've drawn in a positively sloped aggregate supply curve, suggesting that as prices increase, firms become willing to supply more at the higher price. The equilibrium is at A, where the price level is PA and the equilibrium level of real output is YA. At this point, it's probably important to note that at point A, the nominal wage is WA, and the real wage would be the nominal wage adjusted for prices. So just remember that the nominal wage refers to the face value of the wage that people receive, while the real wage refers to the purchasing power of the wage that people receive. Okay, so if we have a supply shock, the effect of that supply shock is going to be to decrease the supply of goods and services, and the aggregate supply curve shifts to the left. That will create excess demand at the existing price level. So if you have a look here, when the supply for goods and services decreases because of, say, an oil price increase, then the amount which is demanded at the price level PA is YA, but the amount which ends up being supplied because the supply of goods and services decreases is less than that, say Y prime. And this means that there is an excess demand for goods and services. Demand, YA, exceeds supply, Y prime, and the consequence of that is that upward pressure will be placed on the price level. And as prices rise, this then causes the economy to move to the new equilibrium, which is at the intersection of the aggregate demand curve and the new aggregate supply curve. Alright, so the big issue with supply shocks is that they cause two bad things in the economy to happen at once. At point B, the price level is now PB, and note that PB is higher than PA, so the effect of the supply shock is inflationary, prices go up. And in addition, the new equilibrium level of output is YB. And so the consequence of the supply shock in terms of real output is that real output is less than before. So the level of output declines. So that's two bad things happening at once. Prices rise, output falls. The other thing just to note is that as output falls, we can also recognize that changes in output often affect employment, and so that as output decreases, employment is also falling. Alright, so that's the kind of basic mechanism of the supply shock happening. What can be done about it? The first kind of thing to look at is that it's possible for governments and reserve banks to not do anything, and we call this a natural adjustment mechanism. And in a natural adjustment mechanism, the government and the Reserve Bank would rely on the fact that over time, the economy would be able to naturally adjust to the supply shock without any further without any intervention from either the government in terms of fiscal policies or the Reserve Bank in terms of monetary policies. So a natural adjustment mechanism basically means do not interfere, don't do anything. If the government and the Reserve Bank decide not to interfere, not to do anything, it is possible that provided there are no additional shocks to the system, that the economy could adjust back to the full employment or back to the original level of output all by itself. So a natural adjustment mechanism basically means do nothing. And if we do nothing, how is it that the economy could adjust back up to the original level of output and to back to the original lower price level? Well, the idea here is that when output falls, this decrease in output is associated with a decrease in employment. Employment falls or unemployment rises. If nothing is done formally in the economy, it could be argued that over time, the bulk of the unemployed people, the kind of rising amount of unemployment in the economy, will put downward pressure on the nominal wage. So over time, the nominal wage will fall. So the idea is that people who become unemployed and who are without work will eventually become willing to work for less. And that places downward pressure on nominal wages. And as nominal wages fall, that then over time will mean that firms' costs of production will be lowered. And as firms' costs of production are lowered, this new aggregate supply curve, AS1, will actually gradually move back to its original position at AS. So maybe I should just label these so that it's clear. This would be 1 for the supply shock, and this would be the direction of the aggregate supply curve shift 2 for when the nominal wage starts to fall. So as nominal wages fall, firms' costs of production are going to decrease. As firms' costs of production decrease, the aggregate supply curve moves back to its original position at AS, and this could be quite a long, lengthy, gradual adjustment. But eventually, the economy will move back to the original equilibrium point. I'm giving it a different label here because at this equilibrium point, which happens after the natural adjustment mechanism, although the price level has returned to what it was before the supply shock, and although the equilibrium level of output has returned to what it was before the original or before the supply shock, there is something which is different in the equilibrium at C relative to the equilibrium at A. And what's different is both the nominal and the real wage. So at A, as we had indicated, the nominal wage was WA and the real wage was WA over PA. At B, maybe I should use this color. At B, the nominal wage is now WB. Why? Well, because remember that for the natural adjustment mechanism to take place, the nominal wage had to fall, which caused firms' costs of production to fall. So the nominal wage is now WC, okay, at that point. And at WC is less than WA, okay? And if we were to now compare the real wage is WC over PA, okay? So the big difference then between point A and what I've labeled as point C is that at point A, the nominal wage was WA and the real wage was WA over PA. Okay? Once the supply shock has happened and once the economy has followed a natural adjustment mechanism which has been able to ensure that prices move back down to their original level and output increases back up to its original level, there is still a difference in the equilibrium at A versus the new equilibrium, if you want to call it that, at C. And the big difference is in both the nominal wage and the real wage. This is because in order for the natural adjustment mechanism to take place, the nominal wage had to fall. So at C, the nominal wage is lower than what it was at A, and in addition, the real wage is lower than what it was at A. So even though the natural adjustment mechanism is able to ensure that prices return to their original level and that output and employment returns to its original level, there is still a cost to people in the economy because both their nominal wage and therefore their real wage is lower than what it was before the supply shock. So just as a kind of quick summary then, if we were to compare point A and point C, at point A, the price level is PA, the level of output is YA, the nominal wage is WA, the real wage is WA over PA. At point C, the price level is PA, the output level is YA, so those things are the same, but the nominal wage is WC and the real wage is WC over PA. And the important thing to note is that WC is less than WA, so the nominal wage at point C is less than the nominal wage at point A, and in addition, the real wage, therefore, at point C is less than the real wage at point A. Okay, so that's the natural adjustment mechanism. One thing to note is that with the natural adjustment mechanism, it is not something which governments typically like to follow. Why? Well, because it's not certain how long it is going to take for this natural adjustment mechanism to unfold. And one of the big concerns is that if the unemployment that is generated when output falls persists for a long period of time, it could result in unemployment hysteresis, which, as you should know by now, means that people who have lost their jobs and who don't quickly regain employment eventually might become unemployable because they lose the skills and experience that are associated with being active employed people. Okay, so that's the natural adjustment mechanism. What we want to do is think about what would happen under an accommodating policy. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put another piece of paper here and redraw the supply shock diagram. So it won't take very long for me to do this. Aggregate demand, aggregate supply, price level, P, real output, Y, equilibrium price level, equilibrium level of output, and we want to draw in the supply shock. And this is PB, and this is YB. Sorry, that was incorrectly labeled. Okay, and this is point B. And so what this particular diagram is going to look at is accommodating the supply shock. Okay, so like in the previous example, there is a supply shock, such as a big increase in the price of oil, and the effect of that is to raise the equilibrium price level and lower the equilibrium level of real output. It's particularly bad for an economy that experiences a supply shock because they experience both rising inflation and rising levels of unemployment. The question then in this case is, well, will the government do anything about it, or the Reserve Bank do anything about it? And if they do, what would it look like? When we talk about accommodating the supply shock, we are thinking about either the government or the Reserve Bank implementing expansionary policies typically in order to try and redress the rising unemployment that happens when a supply shock occurs. Particularly because of the concern of unemployment hysteresis, governments and reserve banks may not want to permit the economy to follow a natural adjustment process, and would be much more keen to try and get the economy out of that rising unemployment situation sooner rather than later. So within accommodating the supply shock, we're talking about, say, the Treasury, which is government, implementing expansionary fiscal policy, or the Reserve Bank implementing expansionary monetary policy. And both of those policies together serve to increase the demand for goods and services. So what I'm going to do is to draw in how an expansionary monetary or fiscal policy would affect the economy, and the way in which it affects the economy is through increasing the demand for goods and services. So when we accommodate a supply shock, that means that either the Treasury or the Reserve Bank are going to use expansionary monetary or fiscal policies to try and increase the demand for goods and services. When they do that, when they increase the demand for goods and services, that's represented by a rightward shift of the aggregate demand curve from AD to AD1. So AD increases from AD to AD1. When that happens, the excess demand puts upward pressure on the price level, so more upward pressure on the price level, which is less than ideal. Talk about that in a second. And the one thing that the expansionary monetary or fiscal policy is able to then address is that the level of output is able to increase back to the original level of output. Okay? So the reason why accommodating policies might be used is because the unemployment that gets generated when the supply shock happens can be redressed through an expansionary demand-side policy, which incentivizes firms to increase production because the demand for their goods and services is increasing. The one thing that you should note, though, is that when we accommodate the supply shock, although it is possible for the economy to move back to the level of output that they started at before the supply shock, prices will rise even further. So there is a cost even to accommodating the supply shock, and that is that prices increase even more in an economy which has suffered a supply shock. The other thing to think about is what's been going on with the nominal and the real wage when you accommodate the supply shock. So at point A, we can say that the nominal wage was WA, and the real wage would have been WA over PA. When the supply shock happened and we moved from A to B, the nominal wage was still WA, but the real wage would have been WB over PA. So that's the real wage at B, that's the real wage at A. At point C, the real wage would have been, this is WA over PB, goodness me. And at point C, the real wage would have been WA over PC. And so that's the real wage at C. Okay? So the big thing to note here is that the the real wage at A is higher than the real wage at B, and that's higher than the real wage at C. So there is no easy way out of a supply shock, is I suppose the point. Even when you follow a natural adjustment mechanism, the real wage falls. In that case, the real wage falls and the nominal wage has fallen. When you accommodate the supply shock, there is no change to the nominal wage, but the purchasing power of people's money does go down. The real wage falls as well.